are so grateful to you that we can come together and be still before you and gather around your word and let you teach us about yourself. I thank you, Lord Jesus, that you have given us Joseph. You have given us this lesson. You have given us this truth in the life of this man of God. And I have to tell you, Lord, I am overwhelmed by it. I feel so inadequate to teach the amazing truth of these chapters. So once again, Lord, I ask you to do what only you can do and speak through your word. For your word is what is powerful and alive and can go into our hearts and shape us into your image to be more like you. So I ask you to do that, Lord. Just speak through us. I pray that our hearts are prepared and receptive for what you have for us today. And we want it to be done, Lord, for your glory, for you are worthy, Lord. You are worthy of our hearts and our lives and everything. And it's to you we praise, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. Now, I have to tell you that you could sense last week, even with before we came in here, there was excitement, and certainly after the lesson, there was just a buzz, is what I thought would be a good way to describe how all we were going. How did we miss this all the many times we've read through the passage about Joseph? How did we miss that? She shared with our teaching at the end of it. She did that exaggeration of saying 586, I think. But she shared some of the ways in which Joseph was a picture to us of Jesus. She took it from this book, Arthur Pink, which is Gleanings in Genesis, a book written in 1922, actually, and I forgot to hand these out. And so what I did, I know that so many of y'all said, I didn't get to write them all down, so I re-listened to it. Thank you, sis. I re-listened to it, and at the top of this sheet, it's the first 13. I tried to write down the 13 she mentioned last week, and the 6 more that we're going to add this week. So I just gave that to you. I footnoted him and James Montgomery Boyce's commentary that's frequently used, that I got some of them for, because Arthur Pink has 101 ways that Joseph gives us a picture of Christ. And so we're not going through them all, but there is there. But I thought, as we were excited about, how did we miss that? I thought of Luke 24. You know Luke chapter 24, which is the chapter of the 2 on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus, the crucified Lord, comes behind them and starts talking to them, and they don't recognize him. And he says to them in verse 25, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So I thought we were excited about our teaching about ways that Joseph looked like Jesus. Can you imagine having Jesus open the scriptures and show you how the places in Moses, the places we're studying, where it talked about him? And I just thought of how exciting that must have been. So we come to today's passage, and I usually don't pay that much attention to the title of our lessons, but it's rightly named today, Joseph over Egypt. Jesus told the 2 on the road to Emmaus, why could you not be surprised that the Christ would suffer in order to be exalted? And that's what we saw pictured in Joseph's life last week. We saw the incredible suffering that Joseph went through, and then how God raised him up and exalted him. And that's where we pick up this week in the 6 chapters. Read them. 6 chapters that we had in our last lesson this week. So we're going to begin with chapter 42, which from verse 41:26 that says Joseph is already 30 years old. So that means he's been in captivity 13 years. And then we know that the 7 years of feasting or of productivity have passed. So that makes it 20 years. The context of chapter 42 is 20 years since he was sold by his brothers into slavery. And once again, in all the patriarchs, famine has been used in their lives. We saw it with Abraham when famine led him to go into Egypt. And that's when he said, you know, Sarah's my sister, not my wife. All that happened. We saw it in Isaac when God said, do not go into Egypt. And he didn't go into Egypt. It was due to a famine. So chapter 41, verse 56, we learned that there was famine all over the earth. And so we have the context of what is happening in the first 5 verses of chapter 42. And I just love how Jacob, when he learned there was grain for sale in Egypt, he says to his sons, why do you look at one another? That just hit me. It's so funny. It's like, why do you stand around doing nothing? You know, go to Egypt and buy grain. And so in this week of exaltation, the 10 brothers are on their way to Egypt for grain. Because, as we see, still in the heart of Jacob is favoritism. Still in the heart of Jacob is that favoritism towards his much-loved Rachel. And he knew this trip may be dangerous, and he did not want to send Benjamin. So he sends them off to buy grain in Egypt. And then we pick up in chapter 42, verse 6, with these words. Now Joseph was governor, the highest of position, over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people in the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. What just happened, my friends? What just happened? That dream that 20 years ago God had sent him twice has come true. It has been fulfilled that the older brothers, will bow down to the younger brother, Joseph. So we see that. We're going to see it again, that God's dream to Joseph and his words were true. And so Joseph saw his brothers, verse 7 says, and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. All right, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, Joseph recognized his brothers, and his brothers didn't recognize him. Joseph recognized his brothers before they knew who he was. Now, there's the 20 years. You and I know that, from a 17-year-old to a 37-year-old man, that could have contributed to it. It also could have contributed to it that the children of Israel, men, they wore beards. They wore beards in the hair, you know, so you didn't really see their face that much. So that could have been the reason they didn't know it. And in Egypt, the movies were pretty accurate. They were well shaven. They didn't have all that facial hair. But it was God's will, ultimately, that Joseph would recognize his brothers, bowing down before him, and they would not recognize him either. And the passage said he treated his brothers like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Now, that may not surprise us. They deserved much worse, did they not? You remember the last time he saw this gang of brothers, they were doing that horrific act to him and throwing him in the pit, stripping him of his robe, and selling him into Egypt. But that's not what's going on here. His speaking roughly to them and treating them like strangers, although it may seem odd, Joseph is doing this for a purpose. The Gospel Transformation Bible states, the adversity of life, what is going on here is the adversity or the hardships of life that softens us sufficiently to make us open to the Lord's grace. and we're seeing through what could be interpreted as vengefulness, something that's really further from the truth, that Joseph, who recognizes his brothers, is actually lovingly treating them this way, harshly this way, because it's in this experience, it's going to get to their heart. It's going to get to their heart through that harsh treatment. And we know this is true because although he's treating them like strangers, he's treating them, he's speaking to them harshly. We're going to see several times where he's overwhelmed with love for his brothers, that he either has to turn around so they don't see him crying, or he has to rush out from the room because he is overwhelmed with his love for his brothers. Because Joseph loves his brothers. Joseph loves his brothers even when his brothers don't love him. And we see this in this passage. And we see this in these chapters. And as we go on from here, and even when he treats them, you know, when he's treating them like telling them what to do, we see his mercy coming in. He's filling their sacks. He's returning their money. He is showing them love and mercy. And he even tells them that he is testing them. We see that in a couple of times in this passage that he said he is going to test them to see if, and ready, this is another one that shocks me. 2 or 3 times in this passage, they say, "We are honest men. We are honest men." Did you not just laugh when they said that in verses 11 and 31, where they say, "We're honest men." The family that is known for their deception and lying, that started with Jacob, you know, and the fooling Isaac, his father, that has gone on repeatedly, that's been passed down to their sons, who lied to their father saying their brother is dead when they knew what had happened to him. Joseph said that he is going to test them. He is going to test these honest men to see if they are. He first of all accuses them of being spies. In verse 9 he said, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." But he's actually making that accusation and accusing them of being spies because he wants to know their personal detail. He wants to know what personally is going on in their lives because he knows them and they don't know him. But he has not heard any update on the family in 20 years. He sees the 10 brothers ahead of him, but he knows not about Benjamin. He knows not about his father. And so he does that so that he can get those incredible details that he's longing for. And he does soon learn. Benjamin's alive. His father Jacob is alive. And they think he, Joseph, is dead. So through this testing, he has learned these things. And they say to him, "We're a family of brothers." Because it would be hardly likely that a group of 10 brothers would go out and spy, be a group of spying. Well, that was the thought here. They don't know about the Incredibles, do they not? A family of superheroes that go out and work together. No. But then, so they see that and they tell it to that, and Joseph does this. He imprisons those 10 brothers for 3 days. 3 days, 13 years, you know, it's all about the same. But it begins to do that work in their lives. And it begins to do it because what we see in verse 21, when they come out, when they're in that prison, and they have that time to think about it, in verse 21 it says, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us." So you see Joseph's plan of dealing with them harshly to reveal their heart is beginning to take effect. Because they're that first step in repentance, is it not knowing I am guilty? And that's what they are saying. We are guilty. And so we see that as they stay those 3 days in prison. And we also learn more detail about when they threw him in the pit, you know, what transpired when they sold him into slavery from our chapters for last week. we find out that it is much more a violent act than we portray it to be when we read it to our children in their children's Bible or when we teach that story in Sunday school. It was a violent act that the brothers did against Joseph. They stripped him of his robe. We knew that from last week. And that word stripping is the same word for skinning an animal. So they stripped him of his robe and threw him into the well. And that word thrown was the word used when you discard a dead body. And of all things, that when he's in that pit, naked and stripped, that Joseph, at 17 years old, is begging for his life. I've never heard someone beg for their life, but I can only imagine what that sounded like. What that sounded like, those pleas, that desperation that he's coming up. And what did the brothers do? They callously sat down and ate a meal, it said. That was the scene, and it's this situation that they are claiming, those 3 days that Joseph has put them in prison, that they are guilty. And so with those words we see in verse 24, hearing their claim to be guilty, they didn't realize that Joseph understood them. There was an interpreter there. He understood them, but he had been using that interpreter. He turns around and weeps. For Joseph loves his brothers. He loves his brothers, though they love not him. And so we have that first time. And so he brings them out, and he comes up with the idea of substitution of one for the other. When he keeps Simeon and sends the brothers off on their way, and off they go back to, he said, if you want more, they have to bring back Benjamin. And so he sends them back off to Canaan and to retrieve Benjamin and come back. And along the way, when fodder was needed to pay for their journey, one of the brothers discovers that their gold, their payment for their salvation of food, this payment of salvation was still in their bag. And they once again, their heart is being broken to the openness, to the softening of God. Because they say, when it's broken of it in verse, and as you go on, it says, what is this that God has done to us? In verse 28, they say it. What is this that God has done to us? They're beginning, they know they're guilty, and now they're beginning to see the hand of God in their lives. They see God working in their lives. And they return to Canaan, and they tell all this detail to their father Jacob, and they say this, and we hear from Jacob. Jacob, old and seasoned in his life. We know all that Jacob has walked through from our past 2 weeks. And we see in Jacob a story, a statement we've heard him say before. Me, my, me. He is once again, it's the story we heard in Shechem after the massacre. Look what you've done to me. This is my, me. He's saying that again with the claim that they needed to send Benjamin back with them to retrieve Simeon. And so once again we see that in the heart of Jacob, and once again that idea of favoritism. He said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he is left alone. Now picture that. He is talking to his 10 other sons. And he's saying this about me and all this trouble they had brought on him. And he was not going to send his one son left. And so he says no. But then we begin in chapter 43, seeing that the famine grows worse and it becomes more severe. And that circumstance led to Jacob sending Benjamin back with them to get more grain. And it was Judah this time who speaks up and pledges his safety. Reuben did before, but he still said no. But now, with the severeness of the famine, and Judah's pledge of safety. He goes ahead and lets him, he goes ahead and sends him along with them, with the promise that Judah would take care of it. What we see here, the very man that sold Joseph into slavery, that had betrayed the younger brother, now pledges his life as a pledge for that younger brother. So you go ahead with a prayer of blessing to El Shaddai. Here we see the God Almighty once again. That's the covenant name of God in these chapters. We've seen it since chapter 17 when God revealed himself to Abraham as El Shaddai. With that prayer of the title of the covenant, they send him off. And they arrived in Egypt for their second visit, and they're taken to Joseph's house this time, to the house of the second most important person in all of Egypt. And that terrifies them, because the thought goes into their mind, it's going to piece all the money, because not only was it the money in that one bag that was discovered on the trip on the way back, the money that they tried to pay for their salvation with food was in every one of their bags. And they thought sure this was why they were being taken to Joseph's house. But isn't it interesting that Joseph's steward says to them in verse 17, I believe, he says to them, verse 23, the steward, Joseph's steward, says to them, peace to you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in that sacks for you. The steward of Egypt sees God's hand when even the sons of Israel could not see it. So in comes Joseph, and once again the 10 brothers bow to him, as was told to Joseph in that dream 20 years ago. And Joseph sees Benjamin, and he is overcome and has to leave. His love for his brother is so great that he is overcome in verses 30 and 31, and he has to leave. And then it says he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, serve the food, the feast that had been prepared for them. And in chapter 43, verse 32, it says they served him by himself, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Israelites, so they were separate. And so Joseph had to eat separate, because he was neither one of the Israelites, or so they thought, or one of the Egyptians. So they served him by themselves, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who wait with them by themselves. You get all those themselves? There's 3 groups of eating going on. Because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. They could not believe that this Egyptian had rightly taken each one of those 10 brothers and lined them up according to age. It says that they were amazed at that, from oldest to youngest, because they didn't recognize Joseph. But Joseph recognized them, and he knew him. And so they ate with him, and he knew it. And they looked at amazement. And then they ate and were merry, and they drank. And off they go again with bags full of grain for all of them to take back to Canaan. But Joseph has told his steward to put that silver goblet in Benjamin's pack, in his sack. And it was an item that would most certainly have been quickly noticed, that the silver cup of Joseph, the governor, would be missed. And so he sends out his steward to overtake them. They overtake them, and the sons of Jacob are so certain in themselves. They're so confident in their honesty. They're so confident in themselves that they say in verse 9, in chapter 44, whichever of your servants is found with that silver cup, he shall die. and all the rest of us, we shall all be my Lord's servant. And notice in verse 10 that they take that verse, that they're so confident in themselves of their honesty, you would have thought they would not have been that, somehow that gold had appeared in their sacks on that first journey. But they're so confident in themselves, and they say, let that person die. But the steward wisely says in verse 10, let it be said, he who is found with it, the silver cup, shall be my servant, and the rest of you shall be innocent. So see, he changes that from a death sentence for Benjamin, that the brothers boastfully, with their confidence in their honesty, turns and see. And so they go through from oldest to youngest, every sack, finding all the money again, but not finding that silver cup until they get to Benjamin. And when Benjamin's sack is open, the money is there, and also the silver cup. And it leads the brothers to tear their robes in grief because they know what that means. They have not done what they had promised their father they would do. They were not taking care of Benjamin. So they all rush back to Egypt. And in going back to Egypt, they once again, we see in chapter 44, in verse 14, bowing before Joseph. 3 times now, and they're going to do it again. They bow, prostrate before Joseph, and they bow before him, and they hear those incredible words from Judah. We hear in the words of Judah, beginning in verse 14, the amazing heart transformation that has been going on in these brothers by Joseph speaking harshly to them, by Joseph doing all these seeming like vengeful acts that they're not. Their hearts are changing. And we see this transformation as Judah was willing to sacrifice himself for his younger brother. God has found out the guilt, he said. Judah pleads for Benjamin, and he says, I shall bear the blame. Now, it's not just Joseph that is picturing Christ to us. Look at Judah in this circumstances. And you know, we've been told to always pay attention to Judah, always pay attention to Judah, because it will be his great, however many greats, sons will be the Christ. It is from his seed, from his line, that Jesus, our Savior, will come. And it's Judah. Remember Judah. Remember Tamar wronging. Joseph selling as a slave. Judah. Judah is picturing us, Christ, saying, I shall bear the blame for my brother. I shall take that blame. So in this situation, he sees it as Jesus, our Savior, who ultimately does that. He takes on my blame. He takes on your blame as he takes on our sins on the cross and pledges for his own sake. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. A little break. I've got a lot of time. It's 9, 10 girls. They didn't change the clock, so I've got a lot of time. I'm going to finish all these 6 chapters. All right, so that's a little humor, sorry. And then we come to chapter 45. Oh my goodness gracious. Chapter 45 of Genesis. It's the climax of all the story of Joseph. You know, it's something that two of the commentators, I think, pointed out. Joseph's story takes up 13 chapters in the book of Genesis. All but that Tamar one, you know, all that is in there. 13 chapters. That's over a fourth of the 50 chapters of the whole book of Genesis. And it's about Joseph. Think about it. Creation was 2 chapters. You know, but he's given all this, and it's coming to a climax here in chapter 45. When Joseph hears Judah saying, I'll take on the blame for my brother. When he hears those words That's it. He knows that heart transformation has happened with them. And so he could not, verse 1 say, chapter 45, verse 1 said, he could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, and he said, make everyone go out of it from here. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. This is a scene that I don't think the best actors in all the world, or the best directors in all the world, could recreate like this dramatic scene that we have for us. So that everyone leaves. It's just Joseph and his 11 brothers, and he says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And with that, can you imagine the brothers? Can you imagine it all? I think it's kind of odd to say, is my father still alive? He's been told that all along, but you can see Joseph's heart for his father. He could not wait to be reunited with his father. And with those words, I am Joseph, they finally see him. They see him, the one who has loved them before they ever loved him. We see that. And it says in the text that the brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. I bet they were dismayed. I bet they were really dismayed. That word dismayed seems so inadequate to me, but it's a word that means sudden terror or alarm. They were scared to death. They were frozen stiff in terror, as you can well imagine, standing in front of who they thought was their dead brother, who is now alive, that they had arranged for his murder. They are standing before him, and he is governor of Egypt. And then we hear the most amazing words of grace. Words of grace that I hope each one of us, you have heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me, please, he says in verse 4. And so he says those words of grace, come, as he announces his identities. He says, come and go and get my father and come. And he says in verse 14 and 15, he hugged them all and called them all by name. He wept, I am your brother. The one who was thought dead is alive. And so the richness of this scene gets even richer. Those first 4 verses seem incredibly rich, but beginning in verse 5, these words are written by Moses. And he says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest, and God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and the Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. This is the richness in these 5 verses. These richness in these 5 verses that says, God, 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 God. This is what Joseph knew. This is what he knew to be true. This is not about you, brothers. This is not about the evil you did to me. This is about God. James Montgomery Boyce says, Joseph's single most distinguishing feature was his ability to relate everything to God. Hardly a sentence Joseph utters does not contain God in it. When he resisted Pharaoh's wife, it was the opinion of God that kept him from sin. When he was interpreting the dreams, he's saying, God's interpreting these dreams. When he named his son, he named them, God made me forget, and God made me twice fruitful. Nowhere is that more evident than in these 5 verses. When he stands before his brothers and he said, not you, but God. God sent me. God sent me ahead. God made me Lord. This is a statement of who our sovereign God is. This is the most incredible picture of his providence and care over us. It's overwhelming to me. Behold our God. This is our God, my friends. It's not what happens. It's not the evil on the one hand. It's not the heartache on the other hand. It is our good, sovereign God. And knowing that brought stability in Joseph's life. An incredible stability that he framed all the events of his life over. Now these actions are evil. That lying hatred that the brothers somewhat understandably had for Joseph, because their father kept feeding it with his favoritism, is evil. It is evil and it is wrong, and it is not from God, because God is holy. He is good. But Joseph attributed what was evil in intent to God's providence. God is in charge of the wicked things of others, so that not just their purposes are not achieved, his purposes are achieved. And those events aren't by accident. It's not because you took that plane instead of the other plane. It's not because you did this over that. God is in charge. God didn't do the evil, but he has permitted the evil and assumed the responsibility. So in verse 8 he said, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. God is accomplishing that good. It's good. Joseph prospered. Yes, he suffered. But he prospered amazingly. And not just him prospering, he's going to save his brothers. He's going to save us by saving his brothers, because this is the line of Jesus. And that is what he told his brothers. God. This was a God thing. Now, that is powerful. And that is hard, is it not? It is a hard thing. I want to read something to you from Nancy Guthrie's book, The Promised One, Seeing Jesus in Genesis. I love Nancy Guthrie. I feel like she's a dear friend. She has helped me to see Jesus in the Old Testament. She helped me see Jesus in Hosea. And she's helped me see Jesus in Genesis. And I don't know if you know her story, but she writes in this book, it is the truth about God's sovereignty over every aspect of my life that has made all the difference in the lowest places of my life. She goes on to share her low points, one of which she had a son, and then she had a daughter, that when she was born, they learned a genetic fatal disease that their daughter had that took her life, as it always does with this genetic disease, at 6 months. And she goes on to write that a year and a half after Hope had died, something happened. Oh, no, I skipped an important part. So because of that, they found out each one, she and her husband were both carriers of this genetic disease, deformity, whatever it is. And so they made the decision they were not going to have any more children, and the husband had a vasectomy. Now, jump ahead to my killer of saying it before you. A year and a half later, you guessed it, she's late. And so she says, when that test came back positive, that she was pregnant. She remembered Genesis 45, and she looks at her husband, and she says to him, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. She said, I wasn't suggesting that God had done something outside the bounds of the natural order, but that he is Lord over the natural order. This pregnancy was no accident that happened outside of God's sovereign plan for our lives. In fact, the confidence that God was in it paved the way for us to accept it, even welcome it. Even when we learned that this child, a son, Gabriel, also had that fatal syndrome. And I don't believe he lived as long as the little girl did. But this is why I set up that context, because we know we have hard, suffering things. But this is what she writes. Recognizing God's sovereignty over our circumstances and embracing a confidence that God would use even this for good made all the difference as we faced lovingly losing another child. Instead of wanting to avoid the suffering, I begged God to make me fruitful in the suffering. Instead of accusing God of abandoning me, I wanted to experience Him like never before in the darkness of the days to come. Knowing that we were not the victims of incredible odds, but the beloved children of God, held in the sovereign hands of God, meant that this was not something that had slipped through the cracks apart from God's notice, but something that was written in the book of our lives and Gabriel's life, even before he began. Stand humbled behind those words. But I want to know those words. I want to have that faith in my God. Do you not? I'd rather tell you all, I'm going to give you all a puppy and a free dinner, and I want to give you good things. But just like Joseph knows, it's in those suffering, hard times we learn who our God is, do we not? And He has promised we will suffer and He will exalt us. Now I want to tell you another story, and it's my story. Some of you know that 35 years ago, last month, I went into Hunt Memorial Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts with all the excitement and anxiety and nervousness of having my first baby. And within hours, it was known that she had died, and I would not go home with my baby as I had planned. That she had gotten entangled in her cord, and that ushered in the darkest valley of my life as I walked through that grief. And what was really at the catalyst of that grief was the fact that she got entangled with her cord and that over her neck and her leg. And when she went to be delivered, she strangled herself. And for whatever reason, during that pregnancy, I feared the cord. And so I had prayed and prayed and prayed and asked God, please don't let her get entangled in her cord. And that's the very thing that killed her. And it was just hard for me. I knew sovereignty. I knew He was with it, around it, and through it. I just finished my master's at school 1 week prior to this. I knew that. But I couldn't grasp around the fact that when she got in trouble, he allowed it. And so I went on with my life. 15 months later, had Matthew. 2 years later, had Bethany. 2 years later, had Ian. And went on with life. And I don't remember how many years later, I'm saying all this for this point. A lot. Might have been 8 years. I need to get my journals and see exactly. But I don't remember what led to the discussion, but John, my husband, and me standing in the kitchen, it led to them looking at me and saying, Mia, you are bitter. And I don't know what I said, but knowing me, I probably said, no, I'm not. But whatever it was, I knew it was true. And I knew John had said it to me. It went to my heart, and I knew it was Jesus. And so I went into my bedroom, and I went to my concordance and looked for bitterness verses. And I came to Hebrews 13:15, if I can find it. And this verse I read, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many are defiled. And I tell you this, my sweet sisters, to know, I let that thought that at that moment God was not good to me. I knew He was sovereign, but I did not allow I believed the lie that He wasn't good. And I had missed his grace. I had hardened that part of my heart, and I had missed his grace, and bitterness had grown up in my life. And most people wouldn't have seen it. But my husband saw that in my life, and God opened my eyes to that, and it was a truth that was ugly and horrific. And the thought crossed my mind as I was reading that verse, I forgive you, Jesus. But that got stuck in my throat because I knew that that's a lie. That's the lie I have been believing all those years, that he had done something that was not good. And so I confessed my bitterness. I confessed believing he wasn't good. And I just enjoyed that forgiveness and that resting and trusting him with this very deep part of my life. It's interesting, that's the verse I read 2 weeks ago about Esau. And if you read the context of that verse, it really got my attention when it showed things that bitterness could lead to. Sexual immorality, all the stuff that I thought I was above, and I am not, and you are not either. But that's what that untruth had led in my heart. And I share that with you, not because I want to, it's ugly, but I share that with you to say, let us take Genesis 45, these verses, and know that he is sovereign over everything. And he is good. Not that we won't hurt, not that we won't cry. I still miss her desperately 35 years later. But I can trust him. I don't know why it happened. I can't say this wonderful thing came from this valley that he's had me walking through. I may not know it till I get to heaven. And then when I see him face to face, I doubt it will matter. But I know that it is God and he is good. And so we see this in this amazing scene in Genesis 45. I want to be different because of Genesis 45. And I want you, my sweet sisters, to be different and live life differently because of this chapter. He is God, and he is good, and we can trust him. We can trust him. So So right now we've got to go through the rest of this lesson if we can, but that's my passion and my heart for you. So we see that happen. They reunite them. He sends them back to to Canaan to get the father, telling them, isn't it funny? He tells them not to quarrel on the way. We have this, he goes back. Joseph, is interesting that Jacob had no trouble believing that Joseph was dead, 20 years ago. But now he comes back, and they tell him Joseph's alive, and he has trouble believing that. But they finally convince him, and God speaks to him and says he can go to Egypt, and he does. And in chapter 46, we have that genealogy that's kind of interesting that we don't have time to really go into. Was it literally 70 people that goes in there? Could have been. I don't know. It could be 70, like the Table of Nations. Remember, that was 70, and they had a lot of tens. 7 and 10 are the numbers of completeness. And we remember the recipients of the book of Genesis. We remember the recipients which he was telling to them this. Everyone that was meant to go to Egypt went to Egypt. It's a picture of the promise. It's the fullness of those who the Father has given to him. And then we have something else that would have been very noteworthy to the children of Israel, the recipients of the book of Genesis, when they are about to go into the promised land after those 400 years as slaves in Egypt.